Tarsanai Zaiwudan is reliving a story she can barely bring herself to tell. She was held at one of Xinjiang's so-called re-education camps. These satellite images show the site where Tarsanai says she was held, sharing a cell with 13 other women with a bucket for a toilet. And she's haunted by one image, masked men coming down a camp corridor like this one after midnight.
They were 3 men, not 1, but 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body, biting it to the extent that it was disgusting to look at.
Whatever you've heard about human rights abuses in China, the reality is worse. Much, much worse. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Senator James Paterson about the very real threat that China poses to Australia, but worse still is the threat that they pose to their own people, not least of all, Uighur Muslims being thrown into concentration camps in Xinjiang province. In Flat White this week, Alexandra Marshall wrote the most informative and important piece you will read on what is really going on in China. Seriously, go to Flat White now and read it. It is very, very important. Alexandra joins us now to tell us about the horrifying realities inside the world's emerging superpower. Alexandra Marshall, how are you?
Oh, thank you, Gideon. It is a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. Now, this was such an important article on Flat White that you wrote, and it's a harrowing one. It's a very serious one. But look, to start with, riddle me this. We hear so much about colonialism and systems of oppression and events that happened, 1 or 2 centuries ago in the West. But there's colonialism and real oppression happening right now in Xinjiang and Tibet and places like that. So how does that work?
Yes, well, in Xinjiang, China is definitely showing us what it means to be a real imperialist. And China has been using a policy of expansionism and conquest for thousands of years, but it's still ongoing. So while the rest of the world kind of settled down a little bit, China has expanded its interest to take over neighbouring countries and provinces in order to usurp their resources. And in doing so, they, of course, have to suppress the people who are living there. And you don't hear much about it in the West, but China is definitely probably one of the world's worst human rights violators at this moment in time.
Talk us through a little bit about what that looks like day to day in terms of the extraordinarily sophisticated and terrifying surveillance state and the treatment of Uighur Muslims in Xinjiang.
Well, let's start off by first saying that what's happening in Xinjiang is not just about the Uighur Muslims. They started in Tibet. So Tibet was the first autonomous region that the Communist Party really went to town on as far as this surveillance system to control separatist movements. And that's what China's afraid of. They're not frightened of terrorism, which they can control pretty easily. They're terrified of mass separatist movements within the people who live there because they don't want to lose the resources of that province. So in Tibet, it's the water resources that they require. And in Xinjiang, it's the massive intersection of the Belt and Road projects and their gateway into Europe and Russia and down into the Middle East, and also to very important ports and pipelines. And so in order to basically imprison a separatist movement, China has sold the narrative that it's all to do with Islamic terror. And they monitor every part of these people's lives from birth to death. They lock them up if they start to disagree or if they start becoming political with the Communist Party. And it's not just political suppression. They're also trying to basically replace them by their Move West policy, where they're funneling millions of Han Chinese into these tiny provinces in order to basically replace their populations and with it bring the communist ideology so that the locals are almost basically a minority in their own region, therefore their politics no longer matter.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about things like forced sterilisation and dilution of the population with, the Han Chinese and so on, I mean, this is genocide, isn't it?
It's genocide by proxy. So instead of mass murder, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Chinese Party are killing people who they don't like and they're banishing off the streets, but far more insidious is the idea of repopulating areas with a different, not just ethnicity, but ideology. So it's not just a nationality that the Han Chinese bring with them, it's the love of the Communist Party and almost the brainwashing that's been going on in mainland China for so long. They're bringing that to the provinces. And so it's like re-educating the population via their family units. And so they basically have forced and arranged marriages going on. They prohibit people like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans from having the many children, so that eventually in a few generations, China no longer has a separatist problem. It just dies off quietly.
That is so terrifying. I want to go back to Tibet because I think it stands to reason. There's a particular military figure that actually designed this system and is now rolling out in Xinjiang. So talk us through, I guess, what happened starting in the 2010s in Tibet.
Well, basically, I mean, Tibet was one of the first regions that the world sat up and listened to and paid attention to what communism was doing to other parts of the world. I mean, it was a big deal when Tibet was taken over by communism. They were burning monasteries, they were imprisoning monks. Dalai Lama had to flee to India, and then the world sort of forgot. But in the aftermath of this Tibet becoming part of China, we had the rise of Chen, who is a general who's now part of the top echelon of China's party. He's one of the 25 most powerful men in China, and he designed a system to basically entrap and suppress the people of Tibet. Now, that includes putting thousands of police stations, checkpoints in every city block of a city. You're tracked by your DNA. They're making these big DNA registers so that if anybody in your family commits a crime, they can track you back wherever you are. You're not allowed to worship. If you are, you're bussed off to a re-education camp. It's all the sort of the worst parts of George Orwell are in Tibet, and it started with Chen. And he was so successful in suppressing the Tibetan population that he was then moved to Xinjiang on Xi Jinping's command, because don't forget, Xi Jinping is frightened. He's terrified of any weakness in his regime and any separatist movement. So he has employed Chen to basically keep peace in China as far as any uprisings. But there's one quote I want to read to you, and it was from the Dalai Lama's older brother, and I think it really shows us what communism is today and what it means, and I think it'll ring true to your audience. He said, and he's writing just after communism took power, as they described their paradise, it sounded like hell on earth to me, a life of grey, uniform dullness, without warmth, without individual human love and affection, a life not worth living and a world not worth living in. And I thought that was really poignant to what's happening to China today.
In your piece as well, you also wrote about the Belt and Road. And I think on all these issues, by the way, you've written about them better than anything else I've read in Australia, certainly, because, for example, Belt and Road, it's often characterised as being a threat because of debt-trap diplomacy and things like that, and it absolutely is. But what's the broader, I guess, geopolitical significance of the Belt and Road? And talk us through what you said in the article about what we really have to fear from the Belt and Road initiative.
Well, what frustrates me about a lot of Western writers is they write about pieces of the story. They write about the Belt and Road or about Uighur prison camps or about terrorism. They very rarely write about the whole picture. Now, China, communism is a machine. It's not doing things in pieces. It's doing one plan, and it's a very patient kind of operation. Now, the Belt and Road is the main source of why the Uyghurs are being oppressed. It's why the Tibetans are being oppressed, because China is protecting its assets, its infrastructure, and its military expansions. And so you don't build trillions of dollars, and it's about $8 trillion so far, of roads, railway lines, pipelines, unless you're basically gearing up for a war. That's how you transport munitions. So when you see the Belt and Road project, they don't debt trap a port down on the edge of India just for the oil. They're doing it as a strategic military point and port. So with the Uyghur concentration camps, they're all surrounding the Belt and Road major projects. They can't have massive civil uprisings like they were having 10 years ago around vital Belt and Road Initiative ports, because that could jeopardize their infrastructure. But what's interesting is China's got a catch-22 now.
Yeah.
They have to open up their western borders to the terrorists in the West and also to the separatists in the West, and in order to allow the Belt and Road project to go forward. That's where their oil is. That's where their passages to Iran are. But they can't do it because as soon as they do, they're going to open up all the separatist movements and they will lose control. They've got the COVID thing going on right now where they can lock everyone down and control it, but they have to open up in order to expand. So I think we're going to see a lot more noise around Belt and Road projects as they open up their borders.
Well, it's interesting. And look, let's hope that, as with every regime that depends on, state terrorism and central planning and a controlled economy, it all collapses in a heap. But until then, Alexandra Marshall, thank you for writing an excellent, excellent must-read piece. Thank you for shining a light on what the real problems are in China and around China. And as always, looking forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you very much.